Well, unless anyone has objections, I'm going to go ahead and kick us off here. It's a little bit of a smaller crowd. It's one of those beginning of the month things. I'm always curious to see how many people stick around with us month after month after month as we get through this. So it's fun. We also overnight Discord rolled out a lot more community features, so you'll start to see new stuff around the Discord. Please share it with everyone you come across. We're starting to see that there's a lot of people who are intimidated on Twitter and on Reddit to join us. I'm getting messaged by people who are asking, I don't have any formal training. Is it okay? I've never studied philosophy. Is it okay if I join? Things like that. The answer is of course, yes. So please do share out and get more people here, because more people is more fun. I don't think anyone here will disagree with that for sure. A little bit of housekeeping before we get going. We are in the need of more moderators, people who can literally just do minor things, keep the server running, let people in. One of our biggest things that we kind of have going at all times is people being able to be let in when they get here. We don't have as many moderators keeping up on that, and a handful of us are starting to having to do a lot more of it. But beyond that, of course, we are looking for more people to run groups, readings, all sorts of things. The server is now set up to handle a lot more. So if you have a reading you think has an audience, or something that just a handful of you want to do, we are ready to take you on. So just head to the volunteer here channel at the top of the server, and we will take you on. Anything else? I don't think there's very much else. How about the rest of you guys, admins? Anything going on this week that we have to talk about and announce to our listeners at home?
Yeah, let me see here. On Saturday at noon pt2, literature will be continuing our discussion, more than likely with Nietzsche's Birth of Tragedy. Last I looked, that's winning the poll right now, so I think that's the text we'll probably be going with. And Sunday at 11 a.m. PDT is Simone Dunn's continued discussion.
Yeah, and then I'd like to mention that we have Heidegger Basic Writings on Friday at 3 p.m. and Zizek at noon on Wednesdays.
Isn't there, forgive me, there's a second time for Heidegger too, yes?
There's Heidegger Being and Time, but that's on the Continental Philosophy server.
Yes, our partner server.
Oh, that's right. Sorry. So there's two groups for Heidegger Basic Writings. There's one centered in India and on the India time zone, and one on the Western time zone. So the one on the Indian time zone is 4:30 a.m. on Friday. And then the one on the Pacific Daylight Time server is 3 o'clock on Friday.
Nice. I think that's trying to figure out if we can handle and be polite to people all over the world rather than just U.S. So it's good to see that we actually have people in both talks pretty regularly too.
Oh, did y'all mention the Simone group on Sundays?
No. So yes, Simone as well. Sundays. What time is that at, Jack? Does anyone?
11 a.m.
11 a.m. So we are pretty packed. We have room though. There's 1,500 people here. We get most of them coming back to the server actually pretty regularly looking for content. So if you have a reading, definitely hit us up. I think
there's another reading, which is Foucault, Madness and Civilization, right. 5 to 7 Pacific Daylight Time on Mondays.
And then the last little thing is we are working on the zine, which is a compendium of a lot of the content made here and written by members, created by members, drawn by members, painted by members, all sorts of fun things. We have 3D models, everything. So if you have a desire to jump into there, again, hit the volunteer here or whatever, we'll jump you into the Skitscene channel. So, but with that, I'm going to go ahead and dive in. Is there anyone who'd like to give I don't want to say a summation, but I know we had a long discussion Monday last week, and then we also had the review session. Would anyone like to give some highlight notes as we dive into the rest of this section so we can have a jumping off point for those who maybe didn't reread everything last night? Not me. No? Jack?
Yeah, at the review session, one thing we focused on in depth was the relationship of schizoanalysis and what's being called the cure, and maintaining a contrast and juxtaposition with psychoanalysis and where it takes its cure, and looking a little bit more in depth into the incest prohibition and the Oedipal representation and the way they are created, which is not the intuitive way of saying the incest prohibition gives birth to the Oedipal representation, but that there's really more of like a sort of like way they work together and sort of reinforce each other without that kind of like P then Q causal chain.
Right. A lot of the earlier parts of the section are deeply focused on essentially talking through what they call the first socius and the primitive man, and how primitive man came to either be subsumed or have Oedipus sort of written over their history, and talking through how Oedipus does that, the process, and all of those things, which is essentially where we're coming into as we continue our reading. And I think with that, I'll go ahead and jump straight in to the paragraph, and we will begin our reading. This is not to say that the universal Oedipal limit is occupied, strategically occupied in all social formations. We must take Cardener's remark seriously. A Hindu or an Eskimo can dream of Oedipus without, however, being subjected to the complex, without having the complex. For Oedipus to be occupied, a certain number of conditions are indispensable. The field of social production and reproduction must become independent of familial reproduction, that is, independent of the territorial machine that declines alliances and filiations. The detachable fragments of the chain must be converted, by virtue of this independence, into a transcendent detached object that crushes their polyvocal character. The detached object, the phallus, must perform a kind of folding operation, a kind of application or reduction, rabattement, a reduction on the social field, defined as the aggregate of departure, to the familial field, now defined as the aggregate of destination, and it must establish a network of one-to-one relations between the two. For Oedipus to be occupied, it is not enough that it be a limit or a displaced represented in the system of representation. It must migrate to the heart of this system and itself come to occupy the position of the representative of desire. These conditions, inseparable from the paralogisms of the unconscious, are realized in the capitalist formation. Furthermore, they imply certain archaisms borrowed from the imperial barbarian formations, in particular, the position of the transcendent object. The capitalist style has been described by D.H. Lawrence, our democratic industrial order of things whose style is, my dear little lamb, I want to see mommy. That's what we want to start with this week, apparently. I probably lost half of the podcast listeners, and I'm like, oh yeah, I'm not doing this. Anyone want to start?
Well, I think we ought to remember what went before this paragraph, because in the two paragraphs before this, he mentions the absolute limit and the relative limit, and then he mentions the imaginary limit and the real limit and the displaced limit. And so it's kind of interesting that it's those mentions of these various limits is kind of a combination of imaginary, symbolic, and real of Lacan, and the kinds of things that he talks about in difference and repetition, which is absolute limits and relative limits. So it's interesting that productively what he's producing, in this theory, Deleuze and Guattari together, is like a combination of the imaginary, symbolic, and real, plus the kinds of things that he is concerned with, the difference in repetition, which are immanence and transcendence in relationship to immanence.
All right. I'll take another stab at one. I think the early part of this is talking ultimately about how primitive man has the ability to consider Oedipus. It's an idea. It's a thing they can, as he puts, they can dream of it without being subject, without literally having Oedipus subsume them. And the ways that it has to be there in order to subsume are the following, and he goes through a handful, which is the part I'd love someone to spend a moment or two explaining what each one of these mean, but they're effectively the symptoms of the disease carrying over to the primitive man is kind of how I read that.
Well, I think, so if we go back to chapter 2, one of the things you remember is that, so the nuclear family is not the cause of Oedipalization. What happens is that the nuclear family work as, they work as, they are what almost, so they're not the cause, but they're necessary in allowing Oedipalization to take place. So that's why they say, right, we cannot just say, oh, so it's the prohibition of incest that acts as a form of social repression, that causes the displaced representative and the signifier that crutches the referent of the germinal flux of desire. We can't make a statement like that because, in order for social repression to work, the tools of social repression in a way are psychic repression. And psychic repression happens in the family, I think, for Deleuze and Guattari at least. And I think that social repression I think that the prohibition of incest can only, be Oedipalizing in the case that the family is also structured in such a way that allows for such a thing to occur. And that's why in the last chapter, right, they talked about all the things that happen in the family, right? These almost subtle things of global persons, biunivocalizations, right? So extrapolation or the creation of lack. So that's the example of the phallus or the mythic transcendent object of representation, which refers to the illegitimate use of the connective synthesis, which is the global and specific rather than non-local and non-specific. And then we get to the double bind, right? The exclusive use rather inclusive and non-restrictive, and then you have biunivocalization in the illegitimate use of conjunctive synthesis. All these together, they create the docile subject that's allowed for the social repression to take place, or the prohibition of incest to enact its sort of prohibition. So I think that they're recapping that in a way.
That sounds spot on. Thank you for that, Varun.
Yeah, and I think to that point too, one thing I've been reflecting on is there's a way that something like the Oedipal representation has to be able to circulate, similar to how we talked about the circulation of women in these societies. And I think that's part of what they're expanding on here, to Varun's point, is that this society's territorializations, its structure, the social repression that's here, isn't able to allow for Oedipus to become a complex or structure, if you like. And like Varun's saying, it's because in a large part, you can't get Oedipus to circulate into the family in the way that we know it to, and that it's structuralizes in our context, because these societies don't have that kind of circulation network. And so that in that way, there's there's kind of this necessity that social production and reproduction be tied up with familial production. And in these societies, in the primitive societies, you don't have that connection where everything's falling back in that way. But in Oedipalizing, you can create that network for circulation and for falling back in that manner.
I think, to read the prohibition of incest in I think they make this point also. It's like to read the prohibition of incest in at least in the primitive society of savagery, as we looked at that, I think to read the prohibition of incest as actively repressing that's already an Oedipalized interpretation of the prohibition of incest, right? Because keep in mind, they don't have the similar structure of the nuclear family with all its biunivocalizations or all its illegitimate uses of paralogisms as we have in the current state of capitalism, where there's a massive divide versus social reproduction and desiring production. So I guess I think one of the points they're trying to make is to interpret the prohibition of incest in such a way. It's already an Oedipalized take. That's why we're already Oedipalized, because we're interpreting it in such a way that, so it's automatically caused by all of this.
Yeah, precisely. If we were to go back into the section, right, we've seen how the Oedipal complex is about, it's not just about a relationship of sexuality, it's about what it does to all the other relationships of sexuality, all the other desires in that manner. And in this primitive society, those flows and everything, those networks don't give themselves up to Oedipalization. So that's why, to that point, there's a way that it has to be connected, like they're saying, in a one-to-one manner, such that Oedipus can circulate, because the social repression of the primitive societies is through the filiative and the alliant. It doesn't have the nuclear family, like Varun's saying. It has other mechanisms.
One thing that we should mention is the fact that they're saying that for Oedipus to take over in a primitive society, it says for Oedipus to be occupied, a certain number of conditions are indispensable. And then he goes through 5 different conditions in a process. The first one is the field of social production and reproduction must become independent of familial reproduction. 2, the detachable fragments of the chain must be converted by virtue of this independence into a transcendent detached object that crushes their polyvocal character. 3, the detached object must perform a kind of folding operation. 4, it must establish a network of one-to-one relations between the two. And 5, it must migrate to the heart of the system and itself come to occupy the position of the representative of desire.
Exactly. Those are basically the 5 paralogisms. Exactly what you said. That's also what I was talking about. It's the 5 paralogisms that are prevalent in the nuclear family, as we saw last time.
Thank you for all of that. It helps me understand a great deal more about this. And I think, it's just great. Really like that. Good shit. All right, I'm going to continue reading. Now, on the one hand, it is evident that the primitive formations do not come close to fulfilling these conditions, precisely because the family, when open to alliances, is coexistive with and adequate to the historical field, because it animates social reproduction itself, because it mobilizes or causes passage of the detachable fragments without ever converting them into a detached object. No reduction whatever, no application is possible that would answer to the formula 3 + 1, the 4 corners of the field folded into 3 like a tablecloth, plus the transcendent term that performs a folding operation. Speaking, dancing, exchanging, and allowing to flow, and even urinating in the midst of the community of men, as Perrin himself puts it, to express the fluidity of the flows and the primitive codes. At the heart of primitive production, one always finds oneself at 4 + n in the system of ancestors and affines. Far from being able to claim that here there is no end to Oedipus, one sees that it never manages to begin. One is always brought to a halt well before 3 + 1. And if there is a primitive Oedipus, it is a neg Oedipus, in the sense of neg entropy. Oedipus is indeed a limit, or a displaced represented, but precisely in such a way that each member of the group is always on this side of, or beyond, without ever occupying the position. Gardner has understood this very well in the formula we cited. It is colonization that causes Oedipus to exist, but an Oedipus that is taken for what it is, a pure oppression, inasmuch as it assumes that these savages are deprived of the control over their own social production, that they are ripe for being reduced to the only thing they have left, the familial reproduction imposed on them is being no less Oedipalized by force than it is alcoholic or sickly. To read the footnote that goes with this. Regarding the coextensity of marriages with the primitive social field, see Jolin's remarks, page 256. Marriages are not governed by kinship laws. They obey a dynamic that is infinitely more complex, less rigid, whose invention at each moment utilizes a number of coordinates of another order of importance. Marriages are more apt to be a speculation on the future than on the past, and in any case, these marriages and their speculation derive from what is complex, not from what is elementary, and never from what is rigidly fixed. The reason for this is not by any means that man knows laws only so he may violate them. Whence the stupidity of the concept of transgression.
One thing this reminds me of is earlier they wrote that Oedipus acts as a kind of, if I can remember correctly, Oedipus acts as a kind of euthanasia for ethnocide, not genocide, ethnocide. And I think that last sentence in this paragraph really demonstrates how that works, because euthanasia is often presented as something along the lines of where someone is suffering so much, or they're at a point in life often that they're looking for a way out through death, right? And there's a peaceful way for them to go in that sense. What I like about this sentence is the euthanasia seems to be in recognition of reterritorializing, of changing these networks to connect differently and to flow differently, and placing new things in circulation and taking other things out. And in that way, I think you can really start to see what they're talking about in terms of like the ethnocide almost works as the social repression here, and the social like reterritorializing. And then you can see on the other side, it's something like the Oedipalization, the Oedipal representation, and the way that it helps, it provides like a way of dealing with the fear of decoded flows, provides a kind of euthanasia for these, for the colonialized people.
It also sounds as though he's saying here the way to think of the 3+1 versus 4+N, which is the difference between a society that cannot be Oedipalized versus one that can, is all it takes is simply having one of the things from the previous paragraph missing. And at that point, it's impossible. Am I reading that correctly? Sounds as though that's the code that he's giving out. No?
Could you repeat that? I'm not sure.
So when he says it mobilizes or causes passage of detachable fragments without ever converting them into a detached object, no reduction whatsoever, no application is possible that would answer to the formula 3+1. The four corners of the field folded into three, like a tablecloth. He's talking about the field of the society. It sounds like he's talking about the previous paragraphs 4 or 5 items, the things that are required for the Oedipus to be part of it. No, is that not what he's referencing?
Yeah, I think that's how I'm reading it too, in the way that like the society before it's reterritorialized is not circulating a detached object or a phallus. It's circulating detached fragments in that sense. And so like, yeah, I think you're right. This is a way of furthering how these conditions compare with one another, and how the society's forms of social repression contrast with one another, and how they can sort of be reterritorialized.
Yeah, well, and I'd love to understand also what they talk about when they say if there's a primitive Oedipus, it is a neg Oedipus in the sense of neg entropy. Terms I don't understand necessarily.
So negative entropy is ordering. So there's an ordering that is occurring with Oedipus. The 3+1 is the father, mother, and son plus the sister. Or like Jung talks about the Trinity plus Mary.
Well, that's the reference they're making. I don't see how it connects today.
I think that the sentence that follows it might help in the way that Oedipus is indeed a limit or a displaced represented, but precisely in such a way that each member of the group is always on this side of or beyond, without ever occupying the position. So in that way, I think what they're trying to show us is that Oedipus as a neg entropy, or like Kent is saying, as an ordering, works in this way of a limit that is also like a displaced represented.
One way you can think about it is like the 3 plus 1 is a system, that's the Oedipal system, but the 4 plus n is opening that up into the meta system. And then what's interesting is that he's using the fold or origami is being referenced here, that he referenced before in one of those steps, that there has to be this folding operation.
All right, I will continue reading because I think we begin having a few moments that start to explain a little bit of this as we go further on. Unless anyone would like to read, I always toss that out, knowing I would get very few.
I'll volunteer if no one else.
All right, Jack, go for it.
All right. I believe we left off. On the other hand, when the requisite conditions are realized in capitalist society, it should not be thought on that account that Oedipus ceases to be what it is. The simple displaced represented that comes to usurp the place of the representative of desire, snagging the unconscious in the trap of its paralogisms, crushing the whole of desiring production, replacing it with a system of beliefs. Oedipus is never a cause. It depends on a previous social investment of a certain type, capable of falling back on family determinations. Sorry for the French. It will be objected that such a principle is perhaps valid for the adult, but surely not for the child. But in effect, Oedipus begins in the mind of the father, and the beginning is not absolute. It is only constituted starting from investments of the social historical field that are affected by the father. And if it passes over to the son, that is not by virtue of a familial heredity, but by virtue of a much more complex relationship that depends on the communication of the unconscious, with the result that, even in the child, what is invested through the familial stimuli is still the social field, and a whole system of braits and extrafamilial flows. The fact that the father is first in relation to the child can only be understood analytically in terms of another primacy, that of social investments and counter-investments in relation to familial investments. This will be seen later at the level of an analysis of deliriums. But already, if it appears that Oedipus is an effect, this is because it forms an aggregate of destination, the family become microcosm, on which capitalist production and reproduction fall back. The organs and agents of the latter no longer pass through a coding of flows of alliance and filiation, but through an axiomatic of decoded flows. Consequently, the capitalist formation of sovereignty will need an intimate colonial formation that corresponds to it, to which it will be applied, and without which it will have no hold on the productions of the unconscious.
Yeah, that's a great paragraph. It's sort of a recapitulation of everything.
So I just think that we ought to, this paragraph kind of brings a reminder that, the incest taboo, the whole purpose of it is to support, the patriarchal system, so that the men know that which children are theirs, so that their names can be passed on. And so then these incest relationships, which are like the paradoxes that appear within that system, like the father daughter relationships, the mother son relationships. It turns out that if you look at statistics, the mother son relationships are very rare. The father daughter relationships that go against the taboo is much more prevalent. and then also there's child abuse. So, I mean, what's interesting is that the whole psychic economy is being interpreted in the Oedipal system by a rare occurrence rather than the predominant occurrence.
Yeah, I mean, I think, I don't think that's what they're saying here, though. So primarily what they're saying is, at least, it's that the family allows the conditions for Oedipalization in the sense that it has, the global objects and all that stuff, and bi-unit vocalizations and double binds at place. But what happens is it's from that we have docile subjects, and social production is able to, then work with the prohibition of incest to bind desire to, a locale that's unsavory almost, the incest locale, for example, when we have the displacement of desire through that signifying regime in a way of the prohibition. I think what's interesting is they start talking about, this aspect of the father, right? One of the questions, if you go to chapter 4, they start asking is like, what comes first, the father or the son? And for psychoanalysis, you're always trapped in this. It's in a spot where it's always the return of the repressed from childhood, and in this sense, you don't consider the entire social field. And what they're regurgitating back is that, because since we've not considered the social field of placing social repression as a primacy, we've had all these paralogisms everywhere. Wilhelm Reich was the first person to talk about social repression's primacy in this way, but he didn't have the concept of desire machines to merge the two economies, libidinal and economic. And so in this case, under capitalism, the divide is the greatest, right? And that's why they also give the explanation for the decoded flow and stuff like that. So, and it's under the nuclear family that this divide is expressed in such a way. And it's so from these conditions that the conditions are apt for Oedipalization. Well, in savage societies, in a way, what they're talking about is, they're talking about philative and affiliated relationships. So from these relationships, essentially we have, we can't superimpose the prohibition of incest in the same way, because how is the family structured in these philative relationships? Well, completely differently, and thus we must consider it in a different way.
Well, so the two paragraphs where we started today, I kind of want to jump a little bit back there, because I'm wondering if the way that this is written in this section is essentially talking about how Oedipus and its conditions become realized, and Oedipus ultimately is formed as almost a machine. They talk earlier in this chapter quite a bit about, and throughout the entire book. One, we know Oedipus is real. It's not that Oedipus doesn't exist, it's that it very much does. But at the same time, they're also saying that there is a series of conditions that kind of build the structure that produces Oedipalization. I made the comment last week about the zombie that can take any desiring flows from anywhere and is constantly shitting out the Oedipal triangle. Conceptually, what they're talking about here is the mechanics and the mechanizations behind that and how it works. And the specific things they talk about, the conditions that are indispensable, is effectively the different pieces of the Oedipalization machine that gets created and starts spitting out Oedipalization through everything it takes on. And when they talk here, it's the things I really like in this section is what it says: Oedipus is never a cause. It depends on previous social investment of a certain type capable of falling back on family determinations of subsuming them, taking them in. The way I would read this, the last few paragraphs, is essentially saying, look, here is how the machine is built. These things have to exist before Oedipalization of a society can commence. And once it's commenced, we need to understand that Oedipalization is not where it starts, that there's these other things that it's subsuming, and these other little pieces kind of got put in place that caused this sort of feedback loop that is Oedipalization.
Yeah, it's a genealogical question, right? It's what are the possible conditions that allowed this to occur? And the possible conditions they're varied, right? They're the division in the nuclear family between libidinal and economic activities, or the way the nuclear family has double binds, bi-unit vocalizations, and these segregated or exclusive use of disjunctions or global objects, and the transcendent phallus, for example. And essentially from these divisions, when there's a prohibition of incest imposed over it, we have psychic repression produces subjects that are essentially from the primacy of social repression, right? The role of psychic repression, I guess, for social repression works more as a tool, right? That psychic repression causes you to desire more social repression in a way. And in that sense, it's from that psychic repression that we have docile subjects to be allowed to be repressed by the social repression, and from the social repression that's placed as a primacy for Deleuze and Guattari, the prohibition of incest can work that way to create Oedipalized desire. Now, in the affiliative and affiliative families, we need to be more careful if we're going to make that claim, right? Because we're not in capitalism now; we are in what they deem the savagery society.
And so if we move into the capitalist society, this thing they're saying at the very end of the paragraph here, but through an axiomatic of decoded flows, consequently, the capitalist formation of sovereignty will need an intimate colonial formation that corresponds to it, to which it will be applied, and without which it would have no hold on the productions of the unconscious. Essentially, without the Oedipalization that came in through colonialization, which happens with psychic and social repression, they would never effectively be brought into the sovereignty that is capitalist formation.
Yeah, but I was focusing on this sentence, this phrase that says Oedipus begins in the mind of the father. And the beginning is not absolute. It is only constituted starting from investments of a social historical field that are affected by the father. So in the patriarchal system, what the father values is knowing who his children are, so he can pass on his inheritance to them.
So sorry, I apologize, Kent. I'm having it.
The point is that father daughter and mother son incest are rare corner cases that are produced by the system of repression by which the men are in charge of the women and use them for social reproduction.
So then would those be in effect in a matriarchal society as well? Or is this part of where they're talking about, because they've talked earlier at this point about how it doesn't matter quite as much that it was a matriarchal or patriarchal society, that the Oedipal triangle essentially forces things to become centered on the father?
It doesn't work in matriarchy, because in matriarchy it's the wife's brother who's the important figure who acts as the father. It's a completely different system. The person who is responsible for the children is the wife's brother, not the father. The father comes in.
They talked about the uncle earlier, yeah.
The father comes in and out, but the women stay at home, and so the brother takes over the role of the father, like in my society.
Can you tell me where in the text you're getting this from? Because I'm sorry, I'm a bit slow in this regard.
Okay, so the thing so we keep talking about Oedipus, we keep talking about mother-son sexual relationships, because that's what the Freudian focus is, and the Lacanian focus is. But I think it's good to remember the context. And the context is that what's important in the patriarchal system is knowing who the offspring are. And so that's why the taboos exist. But then when you put the taboos in place, there are these corner cases like father-daughter incest, sister incest, mother-son incest, that become paradoxical within that taboo system. And what the Freudians have done is they have taken the most rare case, just looking at his statistics, where they try to estimate how much mother-son incest occurs, and it's very rare compared to father-daughter incest. And so the Freudians have taken the rarest case and made it the universal desire. And then they projected that back on children. So that's why we see this as a perversion of the normal economy of desire. Now, why would they do that? The reason they do that is to deflect blame from the fathers.
Wouldn't I'm going to go back to earlier parts of this because I think this is a worthwhile discussion because I don't fully have a background in Freudian everything, but I'm going to go with what Lou said. That's my reading as well, is that Deleuze and Guattari essentially rejected this because of how they talked about filiation and alliance and how those things sort of began in and they keep using the word savage societies, but savagery, the primitive societies. So
exactly, I agree with Lou in that point. Is that I don't think I really agree with Kent Palmer there, because I think we can't make that sort of assumption because it's anthropological in the sense that we're looking at two different societies and they're completely different ways. We can't make that assumption. So I agree with Lou here.
But they did talk about earlier, and I'm trying to find the exact part of this because I know I was reading this in Holland last week as well, when they talk about it's not so much that, and I think they were directly talking to Freudian thinkers or Freud himself, that the moment that Oedipus creates that desire, it's about sort of creating that tributary of flows away from the main desire and giving a place for that unbridled place to go. But the reason that the time they were doing that happened almost simultaneously, that upon the Oedipalization, those desires are coded. It's not that the desire actually exists prior to that, and it's also not that the desire is created by the prohibition. It's neither one of those, that it becomes part and parcel of the cessation of the desire and the Oedipalization. Unless I'm reading earlier parts wrong and I'm trying to find the section.
My recollection.
So my point is just that they're rejecting Oedipus for good reason, and you have to read it back against Freud and Lacan and see what Freud and Lacan are doing by supporting this idea of Oedipal incest between mothers and sons.
Oh, okay. So I was mishearing what you were saying. I'm sorry, Kent. How I was taking it is different. You're essentially talking through the fact that we've had Oedipal, even from a purely almost historical scientific perspective with everything, is that this is one of the most rare, exceptionally rare desires, and so it's such an asinine place for us to start with anyway.
Yeah, they've taken the rarest case. When people have studied this, if you look for the statistics, it's the rarest case, and they've universalized it. So then you have to question what, and not only have they universalized it, within Western society, they've universalized it in colonialization as well. And so then you have to say, well, who benefits from that? And the person who benefits is the father, who's left out. In other words, father-daughter incest is not concentrated on, it's considered an illusion. The real desire is the desire of the son for the mother, the father's left out.
Interesting. Okay, understood. Any other comments before we move on? All right, I think we were on given these conditions.
Yes.
Yeah, I think they're also talking about the father here. I think they're referring to the fact that psychoanalysis sort of treats the person as they're sick from childhood, right, in a way. And so it's like the child comes before the father in a way. They'll talk about it in chapter 4, and I think that's what their sort of allusions are in this when they refer to the father. And that's how they interpret the way Freudianism would interpret the return of the repressed.
Just wanted to point out too, right, where these so they say that the fact that the father is first in relation to the child can only be understood analytically in terms of another primacy, that of social investments and counter investments in relation to familial investments. that will be seen later on with the level of analysis of delirium.
Exactly.
So,
Yeah. And the way they're always plugged into the social field, right? That's why they get the example of the schizo who hallucinates universal history, right? Or the schizo becoming Negro, the sort of transracial becomings that they have, because they're always plugged into that political field.
Yeah, and to that point, it's the social investments that work so as to creep into the father, and then that to creep into the son. If I can be. If you'll give me the liberty to use the word creep there.
Excellent. I'm going to move on. All right. Given these conditions, what is there to say about the relationship between ethnology and psychoanalysis? I think this was literally a comment last week we had on Reddit. Why would you have ethnology in the title? Let's get to the answer. Must we be content with an uncertain parallelism where each contemplates the other with perplexity, placing in opposition two irreducible sectors of symbolism? A social sector of symbols and a sexual sector that would constitute a kind of private universal, a kind of individual universal. Transversals between the two, since social symbolism can become a sexual material and sexuality a ritual of social aggregation. But the problem is too theoretical when posed this way. Practically speaking, the psychoanalyst often claims to explain to the ethnologist the meaning of the symbol. It means phallus, castration, Oedipus. But the ethnologist asks other questions and sincerely asks himself, of what use can psychoanalytic interpretations be to me? Hence the duality is displaced. It is no longer between two sectors, but really two kinds of questions. What does it mean? And what purpose does it serve? Of what use is it, not only to an ethnologist, but what purpose does it serve, and how does it work in the very formation that makes use of the symbol? We'll read the footnote now. Roger Bastide has systematically developed the theory of the two symbolic sectors in Sociologie et Psychoanalyse, but starting from a viewpoint that is analogous at first, E.R. Leach is led to displace the duality, causing it to pass between the question of meaning and that of use, thereby changing the scope of the problem. See magical hair, reference note 24. I'll get to that while someone's going over this. Whatever may be the meaning of a thing, it is not certain that the thing serves any useful purpose whatsoever. It is possible, for example, that Oedipus serves no useful purpose, either for psychoanalysts or for the unconscious. And to what use could the phallus be put, since it is inseparable from the castration that deprives us of its use? Of course, we are told not to confuse the signified with the signifier, but the signifier takes us beyond the question. What does it mean? Is it anything other than the same question, only this time barred? This is still the domain of representation.
One thing I'll say that I really like about this particular paragraph and what they're doing in this chapter too is, right, so if we're starting to see how something like even ethnology or anthropology in some level maybe, but there's a way in which these other disciplines, not only might they have a discourse with psychoanalysis, as we've seen, but there's a way even in which they take on an Oedipalization or an Oedipal representation.
Right. I think it goes to show how deep this stuff's ingrained into culture, like the fact that, I think primarily, our primary thoughts in the prohibition of incest is already very determined. And if you go on those thoughts, these thoughts come from somewhere, right? And then, these are going on in sort of a way where it's all deeply ingrained in our interpretations of everything in the world, in the sense that, these structures we find everywhere. And I think that's what they're getting down to, and how Oedipalization, the primary, this is how some people interpreted the prohibition of incest as castrating in the first place, rather than it could be, maybe the familial relationship was different in that primitive society. And the fact that this universal structure of Oedipus can be found everywhere, even in ethnology and stuff.
Yeah, and to that point, if anything, what I'm getting, especially from the last few sentences of this paragraph, is that part of the reason it's ingrained is in fact, this kind of reminds me of something we talked about with Heraclitus on Saturday, but this at least the concluding part of this paragraph seems to be getting at, even if you look at this semiotically, where we're dealing with signifieds and signifiers, the Oedipal representation is so appealing, even if it's not useful per se, or that is to say, even if it doesn't necessarily do something within these things, because it gives you a way to understand and talk about all this. And right, as soon as you apply the Oedipal representation, you're bringing in a discourse, and you're bringing in all these studies, and you're gaining a whole way to discuss these societies, but also to enforce the reterritorialization of them.
With that, I'll move on. The true misunderstandings, the misunderstandings between ethnologists, or Hellenists, and psychoanalysts, do not come from a faulty knowledge or recognition of the unconscious, of sexuality, of the phallic nature of symbolism. In theory, everyone could reach an agreement on this point. Everything is sexual or sex-influenced from one end to the other. Everyone knows this, beginning with the users. The practical misunderstandings come from the profound... No, Siri, what? Sorry, apologies, I'm going to start that over. Siri thought I was talking to it. In theory, everyone could reach an agreement on this point. Everything is sexual or sex-influenced from one end to the other. Everyone knows this, beginning with the users. The practical misunderstandings come rather from the profound difference between the two sorts of questions. Without always formulating it clearly, the ethnologists and the Hellenists think that a symbol is not defined by what it means, but by what it does and what is done with it. It always means the phallus or something similar, except that what it means does not tell the purpose it serves. In a word, there is no ethnological interpretation for the simple reason that there is no ethnographic material. There are only uses and functionings. On this point, it could be that psychoanalysts have much to learn from ethnologists about the unimportance of what does it mean. When Hellenists place themselves in opposition to the Freudian Oedipus, it should not be taught that they put forward other interpretations to replace the psychoanalytic interpretation. It could be that ethnologists and Hellenists will compel psychoanalysts, for their part, to make a similar discovery, namely, that there is no unconscious material either, nor is there a psychoanalytic interpretation, but only uses, analytic uses, of the syntheses of the unconscious, which do not allow themselves to be defined by an assignment of a signifier any more than by the determination of the signifieds. How it works is the sole question. Schizoanalysis forgoes all interpretation because it forgoes discovering an unconscious material. The unconscious does not mean anything. On the other hand, the unconscious constructs machines, which are machines of desire, whose use and functioning schizoanalysis discovers in their imminent relationship with social machines. The unconscious does not speak, it engineers. It is not expressive or representative, but productive. A symbol is nothing other than a social machine that functions as a desiring machine that functions within the social machine, an investment of the social machine by desire. That's a good That's a good paragraph. I like that paragraph.
I mean, on the fold, Deleuze talks about this as, taking. And he takes this from Simondon, right? And Simondon in crystallization, it's going from structures into operations, and that's why they use the term machine, right? If you read that essay by Guattari that he published, Machine and Structure, the whole point of that essay is to go away from structures into operations, and operations are understood as machines defined by a set of syntheses. Now, I think what's key is that they're actually referring to something what they were talking about in chapter 1, right? That's the example of the knife rest. What good was a knife rest if all we were given was a physical description of its properties, right? So you can't understand something from that, and that's something like that's what they mean by meaning or representation in a way, because it doesn't explain Genesis. And from that notion of understanding, and this even goes to to univocity in a way, as what Deleuze was talking about, difference in repetition, that you can't understand something from applying predicates to it. You have to understand something from its capacity to affect or be affected. He takes that notion from Spinoza, and in this way, that essentially, if you understand, I think. And in this way, you're getting to the base of non-representation, which is Genesis, or a genetic account of of ontology. And I think that's that's why they have to use the terms machines as productive. And I think in that way, they get to an unconscious that's fully immanent, or instead of finding the possible transcendental conditions as Kant did, they find all the real conditions for all real experience rather than possible experience of Kant. I think that's what they're trying to do with this sort of transcendental materialism almost they've built up in this book.
If I can make a request of the Simondon group, if we can actually go over, because it's 100% taken from Simondon. So if we could go over that a little bit this week, I would gladly join for that. And I usually don't have time on Sundays, but it would be worthwhile going over where this concept comes from, because it is very much with that background. That would be great. So we'll keep an eye out. Ontogenesis, we're going to discuss in the Simondon group. Excellent. Yay. That makes my day. Any other thoughts on this paragraph? Because it's pretty great.
Just to make a short point about schizoanalysis and the differentiation between psychoanalysis, and to kind of to look at the concluding point, right? Because they're going from like the difference between ethnologists and psychoanalysts and their methods to go into schizoanalysis and what it's going to do, which is that it recognizes the unconscious as constructing machines, and the way that those machines have an imminent relationship with social machines. So one thing I like here is they're looking at the unconscious as an engineering entity, I suppose, but as something that engineers rather than speaks. So it's creative, it's constructive, and in that
the idea is that the unconscious effectively builds the structures that machines come out of.
That's again what, as I mentioned, it's going to rather than all possible conditions of experience, all real conditions of experience. And I think one of the key things is that essentially they're talking about there's no teleology here, and that's why we have to understand things from capacities in a way. Because if you don't understand that, then you've created a false sense of teleology that they're talking about. At least in this case, that they don't have to have any sort of end goal, and that's also very important, right? For the example of the knife rest.
Well, and a good deal of this is directly referencing, ultimately the goal of this project, which is to talk about a materialist psychoanalytic view. And that's the idea that these machines are real, as they go over, and they say many, many, many times. The machines are real, even the unconscious ones. They are things that are producing, that they are connecting, they are working within a lot of things that are happening around. The idea of having that machinic view, materialist view of these elements, even ones that generally speaking, and I know this is if the Zizek group ever wants to go over organs without bodies, it's one of the things Zizek really rails against, but it's one of the things that always attracted me to Deleuze personally, is the idea that these elements are, I know organs without bodies is garbage. Varun, you would go over this every week. But I think there's an attraction for me about the idea that all of this can ultimately become materialist rather than having this sort of psychoanalytic layer, which also is very attractive to me, but having that be sort of in the clouds, as they say in this little paragraph, which I really like.
I think one of the things that actually Zizek says, and he goes against pretty far. One of the things, as I said, they're trying to do is they're trying to make libidinal economy the same thing as political economy. And that's why they say sexuality is everywhere, right? Desiring machines are at work everywhere. And, one of the things that Zizek actually makes the point is that you can't have libido applying to all these concepts. So Zizek sort of says that, you can't say that the way we invest in the social field is the same way we invest, when we stick a dick up someone's vagina or something like that. And so I think that's one of Zizek's main point, that you can't say sexuality is everywhere. I don't know. What do you think about that, Brooks?
Well, and at the same time, you can say that Zizek goes against that, but he's also absolutely says what they say here at the opening, that everything wall to wall is about sex. And he's got those jokes about it, and everything is ultimately about the phallus, and it's about sex. And it's like, yeah, so you're like, it's, again, Zizek, I adore him. Sometimes he says things I don't really, that don't gel necessarily at all. And it's true. It's not just about dick of someone's vagina. Just saying. There's a lot of opportunities there, but it's an example. But I just love this this paragraph, and we should do a reading, or tomorrow during the review I'll bring up in Chaosophy. Felix Guattari has the balance sheet for desiring machines, which actually references this pretty heavily, and we'll go over a few quotes from that. I won't make everyone listen to them today, so we can get through this section. Any notes before I continue on? All right. It has often been said and demonstrated that an institution cannot be explained by its use any more than an organ can. Biological formations and social formations are not formed in the same way in which they function. Nor is there a biological, sociological, linguistic, etc. functionalism at the level of large determinate aggregates. But the same does not hold true in the case of desiring machines as molecular elements. There, use, functioning, production, and formation are one and the same process. And it is this synthesis of desire that, under certain determinate conditions, explains the molar aggregates, with their specific use in a biological, social, and linguistic field. This is because the large molar machines presuppose pre-established connections that are not explained by their functioning, since the latter results from them. Only desiring machines produce connections according to which they function, and function by improvising and forming the connections. A molar functionalism is therefore a functionalism that did not go far enough, that did not reach those regions where desire engineers, independently of macroscopic nature of what it is engineering, organic, social, linguistic, etc., elements, are all tossed into the same pot to stew. The only unities, multiplicities that functionalism must know are the desiring machines themselves and the configurations they form in all sectors of a field of production. A magical chain brings together plant life, pieces of organs, a shred of clothing, an image of daddy, formulas and words. We shall not ask what it means, but what kind of machine is assembled in this manner? What kind of flows and breaks in the flows in relation to the other breaks and other flows? It's a paragraph I actually think I understand, which happens once in a while. But just to quickly go over, they're talking about the need for us to not look at things as all giant sort of large-scale things, institutions, whatever is large-scale, they just flat out refer and go right to molar and molecular, and instead encourage us to continue to break down the little desiring machines, the apparatuses that make it up. And if we still haven't been able to figure out what it does, then that means we just need to break it down further and further and further until we get to that very base level, thousands, millions, whatever it may be, machines, that each of which do a thing. And that thing then feeds into another machine, and we're able to begin tracing that out. And with that gigantic collaboration constellation of machines, that becomes the molar institution, which you can't say an institution necessarily is a use or produces something, but the machines all do.
Yeah, I think that's exactly what they're talking about, in the sense that, I think another interesting thing that they say is, they have a university of machines here, right? I think, Deleuze wanted to put everything on a plane of immanence, but he still kept intensive hierarchy and difference and repetition. The hierarchy of intensities, despite the fact that the ontology of was completely immanent. And I think it's similar with machines here, right? It's very similar to that. There's still intensities which are hierarchical, right? The zero in relation to the full body without organs of potentials and stuff like that. But in this case, there's still, in terms of the university of machines, in the sense that I think they say that each machine can be plugged into another machine, right? In the same way that the orchid can reproduce with the wasp, right? There's something of there's a giant sort of plane of immanence in the regard that, I think if we look at this from a very superficial view, we can say that orchid and wasp are two completely different entities, but they're on the same plane of ontological immanence in the regard that they can both connect to each other in this manner. And I think that's what they're trying to say also, is that since they're all univocal, everything is a machine, as they state, right? So let's say everything is a machine, but not everything is a desiring machine, right? Because desiring machine has to have the connection of flows. But if everything is a machine, it's almost in a way, it's like saying everything can connect to everything. Like something so alien as an orchid and a wasp can interact with each other to produce an entity. It's like that whole. I think there was a whole debate back actually when this was happening with Descartes, who said that essentially that you can't have machines can't reproduce or blah blah blah. But in this regard, these machines do reproduce because they find these even with alien sources, right? And then I think even Simondon in The Mode of Existence of Technical Objects is a debate that he's answering to, is how do machines reproduce? In this regard, the orchid and the wasp, two completely alien entities, are still on the same plane of ontological immanence in this regard.
I love the sentence in here that is basically a direct, almost like they were speaking to Lacan as he's reading this. A magical chain brings together, it feels like that's really sarcasm, and so I'm saying it. A magical chain brings together plant life, pieces of organs, a shred of clothing, image of daddy, formulas, and words. Is a Lacanian symbolic chain that makes up a lot of what he considers to be the issues people may have, the problems they have in life. And they're like, no, the chain's what's produced. The chain doesn't do anything. So the question would be, what kind of machines actually make that chain? And that's a much more useful way to look at their, essentially, that sentence to me is their entire pitch around materialist psychoanalysis. Really like that. Any last thoughts before I continue and move on? Excellent. I always put it out there. You never know. Analyzing the symbolism of the forked branch among the Ndembu, Victor Turner shows that the names given to them form a part of a chain that mobilizes the species and the properties of the trees from which the branches are taken, as well as the names of these species in turn, and the technical procedures with which they are treated. Selections are made from signifying chains no less than from material flows. The exegetical meaning, what is said about the thing, is only one element among others, and is less important than the operative use, what is done with the thing. Or the positional functioning, the relationship with other things in one and the same complex, according to which the symbol is never in a one-to-one relationship with what it means, but always had a multiplicity of reference, being always multivocal and polysemous. Analyzing the magical object booty among the Kikuyu of the Congo, Pierre Bonafé shows how it is inseparable from the practical syntheses that produce, record, and consume it. The partial and non-specific connection that combines fragments from the body of the subject with those of an animal. The inclusive disjunction that inscribes the object in the body of the subject and transforms the latter into a man-animal. The residual conjunction that causes the residue to submit to the long voyage before burying or immersing it. I'm not going to read the bottom part. It's an explanation of that. If present-day ethnologists are again evincing a lively interest in the hypothetical concept of the fetish, this is unquestionably due to the influence of psychoanalysis. But it would seem that psychoanalysis offers them just as many reasons for doubting the notion as it offers for attracting their interest. For psychoanalysis has never said phallus Oedipus castration more often than apropos of the fetish. Well, for his part, the ethnologist senses that there is a problem of political power and economic and religious force inseparable from the fetish, even when its use is individual and private. Hair, for example, the rituals of haircutting and coiffure. Is there any interest in referring these rituals to the phallus entity as signifying the separate thing? And in everywhere re-encountering the father as the symbolic representative of the separation? Wouldn't this be tantamount to remaining at the level of what it means? The ethnologist finds himself before a flow of hair, with the breaks in such a flow, and with what passes from one state into another through the break. As Leach says, hair as a partial object, or as a separable part of the body, does not represent an aggressive and separate phallus. Hair is a thing in its own right, a material part in an aggressing apparatus, in a separating machine.
Right, yeah, I think that's ontological immanence, right? You can't,
yes.
They're trying to keep that sort of multiplicity of, this thing is its own thing. It's not a representation of something else, or it's not it's not repeating the act of the return of the repressed. It's just the thing as it is. The train is not the repetition of Daddy's Cock or something like that, as Melanie Klein had it. It's just the train is the train.
The train is the train, and it's being produced there. The connection to it is being produced by a machine. What machine produces XY activity around the train, or the signifying chain that happens around the train.
Right. And, but you have to keep in mind also what they're talking about is before a relationship that sort of exists before Oedipalization. Fundamentally, in a way, the train automatically does start to signify the father's penis in a way once the Oedipalized relationship occurs. But there's another way of these things operating below at the level of the referent.
Well, and I think that's so to get into that is them saying effectively, look, this is how the primitive mind, the primitive societies work, is they have these machines that produce stuff. Now, what Oedipus does is Oedipus is a machine that actually takes in the things other machines produce and produces Oedipus. It's almost a meta machine that kind of reproduces things in its own image, and that's the sort of difficulty in the direction it takes, and because it can take those things on and actually digest what other machines are creating. That's the terrifying part. That's they keep getting back to that.
I would only say, though, it might be useful to compare Oedipus with a machine, but I'm not sure it is a machine.
Everything's a machine. It is a machine.
Yeah, and I'm hesitant to say it's not.
But there's also where we got the Oedipal representation. I don't know.
I would say
not necessarily.
Maybe if I can cut in here real quick. I would say that it sort of also has something to do with the boundaries of language and translating French into English, perhaps, because agencement, it would be something machinic, but it would also be a process simultaneously. So
this is true, and actually, a lot of times they use apparatus in some other writings when they're referring to a machine, which can also mean structure. Which is an interesting thing.
Exactly. Those are interesting pathways to sort of discover as well. But I have to be honest, I haven't read from Anti-Oedipus before.
No, it's a really fair point. We've actually got our resident guy Roger, who now at this point I think just does not join. He's very active on the server and we talk all the time, but I think he doesn't join because we've kind of put him in the role of, you know the translation and you have it in front of you. You get to be our translator, and I think he's sick of that. But the short version is, I think we've also got a boundary of language to add on to what I'm going to guess Jan was saying. Sorry, I don't. John.
Yeah, Jan. Whatever. Jan. It's a complicated history, so.
Yes, but the thing we're also hitting is that when we refer to Oedipus, we are referring to a bit of kind of both. And it's a limitation in how we're talking about these things because
I understand that.
Everything is a machine.
That meta context as well, yeah.
Yeah, so everything is a machine and everything is producing. There are referents that are not machines, they're singular. The torn piece of paper, all of those things. Now, it can be broken down further as yet another machine. And that's kind of the point they're making to this, is that you need to keep going until you stop asking the why and instead see the thing that's made and what it does. When a machine does something, that's where you kind of don't have to break down quite as much anymore. But we are ultimately talking about Oedipus is absolutely machine. They talk about earlier in the section, actually from our talk last week. God, this is a big section. They actually talk directly about it being a machine and how it takes things in and how it moves things around into being part of the Oedipal triangle. So for sure, we'll talk during the review of this tomorrow because I think this is a worthwhile discussion to have. But
yeah, if I can join in or if we can connect somehow as well, because we're doing a reading group for basically the other side of capitalism and schizophrenia simultaneously. We just started and we just got to A Body Without Organs. And it would be interesting just to audit, some of the moments in your sort of entanglement with the book.
Oh, we have quite a few, and what's great, and I'll edit this out of the final podcast. What's great about it is all the different people we have in here and all the different sort of opinions. It's one of the things that makes it absolutely amazing. If you weren't here earlier, Kent and Varun come from very different places, and being able to hear the two of them have conversations about these things essentially gives me, here's what I need to go read now. Here's what I like. Cool. It's like Cliff's Notes. Like, cool. I'm going to cheat off Kent and Varun as they argue or whatever they're talking about. But I'll say I've read 1,000 Plateaus, and 1,000 Plateaus I find to be, I don't want to say easier or more difficult. In my experience personally, I find 1,000 Plateaus to be much more poetic and interesting, and my brain can wander sort of through the writing. Whereas with this, it's so deeply clinical that there's a million reference I do not have, and it's one of the things that helps me go through is having people like Varun and Kent and the other people here who have, I have some Lacanian background, but I don't have as much as we've got some people here who are ridiculous, Freud, just in general. So, but you're free to join and pop in and out for sure. And please invite anyone else from your group to join.
Okay, we'll do. We're meeting tomorrow. That's UTC +2 at 11. So I'll definitely throw it into the group.
Cool. And they feel free to have them join the review. Our review happens noon Pacific time, US.
Okay, cool.
Yeah.
Coming back to the original point, though, everything has to be a machine. Otherwise, some sort of, otherwise their ontology just doesn't make sense in a way, right? Otherwise, you can't have that notion of ontological immanence anymore.
But I just want to mention that the machine has a very special meaning that isn't suggested by the word machine as we normally use it. It has the special meaning of being something prior to the split between nature and human reality.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, that's why it's at a pre-individual level, and two, it's referring to an operation rather than a structure, right? The example of the knife rest. It's not a knife rest of descriptions. It's a knife rest that can be used for multiple different things and multiple different potentials. Understanding something not from what something is, but rather understanding a thing from what its potentials are and what its capabilities are and what it can do.
Well, I think it's the use of machine as I found troublesome until someone explained to me kind of and had me read a few of the other different works that use other languages around it. Machine in Western, especially in America, has a very gear-based, produces a thing, structural. Like it's very, very based in the machinic sort of nature with gears and all of that. When in reality, what we're talking about is actually just a series of things ultimately that interact and produce a thing through those interactions is ultimately what they mean by machine.
A translation that might be better is operand. Because that to connect it back to Simondon, that's what he says is that it's all about operations, and Deleuze has brought up that before.
And that's the process of crystallization for Simondon, and that's also that's how Deleuze refers to him in The Fold.
So the problem is that machine in English suggests some of the wrong things, and that's why referring back to the French, which is mechanic plus process, is a good thing to keep in mind.
To quote Chaosophy, we are not using a metaphor, however, when we speak of machines, operants. Humans constitute a machine as soon as this nature is communicated by recurrence to the ensemble of which they form a part under specific conditions. They really, really want to drive home the idea that it's basically a series of nodes in a network that interact and produce a thing just by the nature of those interactions. So, all right. Would anyone like to read the next paragraph? I think, actually, are we coming up on the end here? We might be. All right. I believe we're at once again. Once again, it is not a question of knowing if the essence of a ritual is sexual, or if it is necessary to take into account political, economic, and religious dimensions that would go beyond sexuality. So long as the problem is put in this manner, so long as the choice is imposed between libido and noumen, the misunderstanding between ethnologists and psychoanalysts can only be aggravated, just as it continues to grow between Hellenists and psychoanalysts apropos of Oedipus. Oedipus, the club-footed despot, who clearly invokes an entire political history that brings into conflict the despotic machine and the old primitive territorial machine, whence derive both the negation and the persistence of son of a bitch. Can someone say that word for me and tell me what it means?
I think it's autokathoni. It means to be produced out of the earth.
To be produced out of the earth. It occurs naturally, organic in origin. Great. And literally, no one has. There's like multiple ways to pronounce this word. Autochthone. That's great. Okay. I will re-say this. Whence derive both negation and the persistence of autochthony, brought into clear relief by Levi Strauss. But this is not enough to desexualize the drama. On the contrary, in reality, it is a question of knowing how one conceives of sexuality and libidinal investment. Must they be referred to an event or to something that is felt, which remains familial and intimate in spite of everything? An intimate, Oedipal feeling, even when it is interpreted structurally on behalf of a pure signifier? Or rather, is it necessary to open sexuality and libidinal investment onto the determinations of a social historical field, where the economic, the political, and the religious are things that are invested by the libido for themselves, and not the derivatives of a daddy mommy? In the first instance, one studies large molar aggregates, large social machines, the economic, political, etc., and this entails searching for what they mean by applying them to an abstract familial whole that is thought to contain the secret of the libido. In this way, one remains in the framework of representation. And the word is autochthony, and it does mean coming from the earth. So to say the sort of essence of that sentence, Oedipus, the club-footed despot, whence derive both the negation and the persistence of believing that it came about naturally. Oedipus did not come about naturally. It did not come from the earth. It did not come from within us. It is a thing that was created after the fact. It's not autochthonal. I'm never going to use this word again as long as I live. That's a fun fact if everyone wants to know.
The reference here is to the myths in Greece where men sprung from the earth. It was a kind of general mythology in Greece that the original men sprung from the earth.
I think part of this is also in regard to the fact that, the way psychic repressions work. I mean, the way repression works for psychoanalysis is that, we're naturally predisposed to an Oedipus complex, right? It's a universal structure that will occur. And we're also naturally predisposed to sort of repress it in a way. And actually, I'm not sure the naturally part can be applied for the latter bit that I said, but I think in this case there's a primacy to this natural aspect that Deleuze and Guattari are really trying to reject in this way, in the sense that it's it's all these complex relationships, right? The phallus that comes in the illegitimate uses and these transcendental misunderstandings or paralogisms in this case that cause repression to bear on the referent being desiring production.
So when they say at the end of this paragraph, in this way one remains in the framework of representation, is that to kind of get a grasp as they're trying to push back towards the materialist conception that they have? They're essentially saying at the end here, when you are looking at these large molar things that exist, these massive systems and machines that are machines of machines of machines, and you've taken them and applied them to effectively Oedipalize them, you're staying within the abstract. There is no materialist reality with what you're dealing with.
I'd like to mention the Gao book called Oedipus the Philosopher. He kind of puts this whole thing in context of the normal myths of the hero and the initiation process, and says that Oedipus is a philosopher who has failed the initiation process.
Yeah, I think Gao is also cited. I think symbolic. I mean, I don't know if it was symbolic economies or Oedipus the Philosopher, but I think it's cited a couple of times in Anti-Oedipus.
He also wrote another book called Symbolic Economies, which I recommend as well. It's good. Those books are good to get a context for what's being talked about here.
Yeah, I think symbolic economies and Oedipus the Philosopher are what cited in Anti-Oedipus.
I think what's relevant here is the myth of Catamas. I think it's worth going back and looking at the myth of Catamas because Otto Cathani plays a role in there that the, Oedipus is searching for a place to have a city, and then they discover a dragon, and when he sows the dragon's teeth, the men spring up that become the men of the city that that he's founding.
Interesting. So his slays the dragon, takes the dragon's teeth, sows them in the ground, and from the ground and the dragon's teeth grow the men that will lead his city.
Right. And the key point in that myth, I think, is that so when all of these men spring up, like say 100 of them spring up from the dragon's teeth, he throws a stone among them. And so then they set to killing each other, and the 5 that are left over are the ones that he founds the city with. So it's like an image of primordial chaos out of which the city arises.
Sorry, I'm reading the link. Interesting.
The dragons in Western mythology that get slayed are normally the representative of existence. And so, for instance, Zeus kills the typhoon, and Apollo kills the python. Typhoon and python are basically transpositions of the same letters. So there's a primordial fight with a dragon that the hero dominates the dragon.
Also, if I'm not mistaken, and it says in here, Cadmus ultimately bred the line that became the rulers of Thebes all the way through the Trojan War. So the primordial birth of basically the ruling class and hierarchy of one of the largest, oldest Greek cities. That's fascinating.
Well, Oedipus is in his line.
Right. Interesting.
But Laius is the father, and he's the key figure because he's the first one to have a homosexual relationship. So there's a miasm where Oedipus is suffering from the sins of the father.
That's great. The link is in the chat. Any last notes before we move on? All right, I'll read the last paragraph, and then we'll discuss a little bit. We have a little bit of extra time, which is good because I have a feeling we have a lot to talk about. In the second instance, one goes beyond these large aggregates, including family, towards the molecular elements that form the parts and wheels of desiring machines. One searches for the way in which these machines function, for how they invest and undetermine the social machines that they constitute on a large scale. To say that again. For how they invest and undetermine the social machines that they constitute on a large scale. One then reaches the regions of a productive, molecular, micrological, and microphysical unconscious that no longer means or represents anything. Sexuality is no longer regarded as a specific energy that unites persons derived from large aggregates, but as the molecular energy that places molecules, partial objects, libido, in connection, that organizes inclusive disjunctions on the giant molecule of the body without organs, numen, and that distributes states and being and becoming according to domains of presence or zones of intensity, voluptas, whatever. For desiring machines are precisely that, the microphysics of the unconscious, the elements of the microconscious. But as such, they never exist independently of the historical molar aggregates of the macroscopic solar formations that they constitute statistically. In this sense, there is only desire and the social. Beneath the conscious investments of economic, political, religious, etc. formations, there are unconscious sexual investments, micro-investments, that attest to the way in which desire is present in a social field and joins this field to itself as the statistically determined domain that is bound to it. Desiring machines function within social machines, as though they maintained their own regime in the molar aggregates that they form at the level of large numbers. Symbols and fetishes are manifestations of desiring machines. Sexuality is by no means a molar determination that is representable in the familial whole. It is the molecular undetermination functioning within social and secondarily familial aggregates that trace desire's field of presence and its field of production, an entire non-Oedipal unconscious that will only produce Oedipus as one of its secondary statistical formations, complexes, at the end of a history, bringing into play the destiny of social machines, their regime compared to that of desiring machines.
Yeah, I want to go back to what they were saying about symbols. I kind of lost it there because I felt like I was a bit confused there. I mean, I think they were saying something very important, but I think we just missed it. I think we should read that sentence again.
I will not disagree with you. This paragraph's packed, and they are going over a lot of things that is in a paragraph that's already long and yet somehow still packed. So it's worth breaking down. This feels, unless anyone disagrees, this feels like actually a summation of this entire section pretty cleanly.
That's what I was getting as well.
I think one of the things that we have present here is the Nietzscheanism. It's the aspect, I think one of the things they want to get, Nietzsche's concept of the herd and stuff like that, right? So that's why they say, it's when people start coming together, right, forming social groups or social wholes, what we have is sort of molar formation starting to come in, right? And it's from from collectivity or the social wholes forming, or associates that's formed when multiple people come together.
Well, let's actually just talk about one specific. And I love the sentence because it's very clear. Symbols and fetishes are manifestations of desiring machines. Here, the way that we need to talk about things is talking about things in Deleuzian terms as far as what the virtual is. Virtual is the interaction and the manifestation of those interactions that we're able to perceive. It's a perception game in a lot of different ways. But the actual things that interact are the material world, they're the machines. They produce a thing that is virtual. That thing that is virtual here, symbols and fetishes, are manifestations of desiring machines. I feel like it's virtual that is being referred to because manifestations is such a specific word, and I believe they use that. I don't believe it's imperceptible. Okay, it is imperceptible, Varun, in the sense that I'm not able to see it. That is symbolic, but it is virtual in the sense that it is the thing that is created due to the interactions of different items. It feels like virtual here is playing a role, at least what he's talking about. And they use it quite often, virtual, in reference to computer screens, as an example of a thing that is virtual. It's an interaction of parts that we're able to perceive. So it is perceivable, but it's not necessarily something that is not real. It has been a while for me since Diff and Rep 2. You're not alone.
I don't remember. Do they say it's imperceptible? It's kind of hard for me to remember.
So it's not at any point is the virtual imperceptible, because they use virtual, and scholars since have used Deleuzian term of virtual very cleanly to talk about specifically the digital world and computer screens and the interactions there that are virtual. They're a layer beyond. They're one abstracted layer beyond the direct interactions of things. They are the thing that is created from the interactions.
Virtual, it has to do not with possibilities but potentials, right? That they go back into.
Right. And it's kind of the potential. It's where the potential is almost collapsing, but it's that they're like at the moment of interaction, basically.
I think so. When they talk about symbols is such a Freudian concept, right? Symbols is like, it's almost a very representational concept, almost, right? Like you see the object of a pencil, and you're like, that symbolizes in a way a penis, in a way, right? I mean, okay, not necessarily, sure, but I mean, I think what they're saying is, even if it's even if it's what's it called? Even if it's a dream, right? A representational dream, it's still a machine. But it's a machine it's still a desiring machine that's been turned on itself. Even if it's, Oedipus, right? Even if you have an Oedipus complex, it's just the way desiring machines have been assembled. It's just the way desiring machines have been assembled in the social field. No, the virtual, I don't know if it's real only by its effects. I mean, the virtual is real in the sense that all these potentials are stored in the environment, right? The virtual is real in the sense that if you go through evolutionary theory and you shift the clock backwards and you realize that there are all these potentials that are just not actualized, but they are there in the environment, and they're contingently actualized in a way, and these potentials are real. So they are like things. That's why he makes such a big distinction between possible, right? It's not possible because possible has that whole idea of it can be, cannot be. I think the whole thing about virtual is that it's a real thing in the environment in a way.
It's to quote the line Proust says, which is actually a lot earlier in AO. Virtual is real but not actual, ideal but not abstract. That's the Proust line that they use, and Bergson references it quite a bit as well. So the idea behind the virtual is the material things that literally exist, the material reality of the world, have interactions. Those interactions produce things that, as if they were real, but they are the surface effect of the interactions. To quote, I'm just going to take straight from Wikipedia. Deleuze's concept of the virtual has two aspects. First, the virtual is a surface effect produced by actual causal interactions at the material level. When one uses a computer, the monitor displays an image that depends on physical interactions happening at the level of hardware as well as with the user. The window is nowhere in actuality, but it is nonetheless real and can be interacted with. This example actually leads to the second aspect of the virtual, its generative nature. The virtual is a kind of potentiality that becomes fulfilled in the actual. It is not material, but it is real. That's the part where they're talking about symbols and fetishes. The desiring machines effectively are producing them and creating them. They are real. They're not material, but they are real, and we need to consider them real. When they talk earlier about the semiotic chain, and they use the torn piece of paper, the doll, the rock that's on the driveway, whatever it may be, the chain, all of those elements are real. Those are material. Those are real. Those are the things that exist. The machine that produces them is the thing that is material. It's made up of material reality.
Yeah, I think everything is material in this sense. I think it's
everything is real in this sense, but not everything is material. There's a difference between material and real to them, because real and virtual they use exchangeably.
Yeah, fair enough. But one of the things is that they say the body, at least when you go into 1,000 plateaus, right? We get the plane of consistency that contains virtual on the plane of consistency and all that stuff. I don't actually see a lot of that in Anti-Oedipus, to be frank. I don't see. I know they refer to virtual, right? Oedipus is at a virtual state where it's not desire and it's actual, but a desire can be actualized in such an Oedipalized way, right? It has the potential to be actualized in such an Oedipalized way. That's why they almost refer to Oedipus in a virtual sense. I think a difference. I mean, in Thousand Plateaus, right? That's why they say the body without organs is like that whole thing on the plane of consistency, where the virtuals are stored, right? The thing here is, is that the virtual is produced in this book in the sense that desiring machines. The egg part goes later into intensive qualities, but in Anti-Oedipus, it's in the sense that the body without organs is produced at a certain stage after the first synthesis, right? So I don't see this is like I can't give an answer here because I'm not smart.
I don't think there's necessarily an answer here. I think to me, what they're trying to describe throughout this entire part is a summation of everything they've talked about. And what they're talking about is ultimately that for a long time, psychoanalysis has functioned as, what does it mean? What does it mean? What is the thing? What is it really? And what they're saying is, no, what we need to do is you need to look at what is making this? What does it do? And this is why they keep looking at ethnologists and what ethnologists are about. And they keep saying, hey, ethnologists are actually concerned with, well, what does this do? They don't really care what does it mean, because meaning in between different cultures is seemingly meaningless to a lot of ethnologists, especially at this time. Levi Strauss kind of broke that down, and they talk about that quite a bit. But their big point here is that as we start looking at everything around us, or specifically in this case psychoanalysis, but I think it can be applied to everything, we need to look at what it does. And if we're looking at something that is molar items can't do anything. That's not what they do. Institutions, molar things don't do shit. So what we need to do is we need to say, cool, let's break it down into its parts that do make things. And when we start looking at, well, this does that, and here's all these pieces and how they come together, that makes the molar, those molecular items, are the sort of point that they keep going at. And so they're saying, don't look at the symbols and the fetishes. Sure, they're parts of this, but they're being produced. We instead need to look even deeper beyond the symbols and fetishes. That's what I think this sentence is saying is, hey, symbols and fetishes come about because of the desiring machines that are ultimately creating them. And you need to continue to break down. Otherwise, you would say things like with a symbol, well, what does it mean? No, you want to know, what does it do? Well, to know what it does, you need to understand its constituent desiring machines. That's how I interpret that sentence. And that was a fucking short sentence said long. Jesus.
Yeah, that's why we can't understand the knife rest through predicates. We have to understand the knife rest from its capacities of affect and being affected, right? That great thing from Spinoza, or the powers of intensity.
Yes. Well, and I would argue, so Bergsonism, I believe, was written significantly after this. I think
it was before.
It was before?
Yeah. It's from 66 or something like that.
Oh, really? Well, I'm reading this from the position of having read Bergsonism a lot, because it applies a lot more to sort of art and cinema and things like that. So it's more relevant to me. But Bergsonism feels also where they talk heavily about if you want something that's a good introduction into the idea of the virtual or how they're sort of looking at things, it's really worthwhile to read Bergsonism as a sort of short guide. It's not an easy read. It's easier than a lot of reads, I would say. But anyway, that's how I read that sentence, and sort of this entire paragraph is talking through that. And the other thing they're very much getting into is that libido, so desire itself, the flows, they keep using energy, and they use a lot of terms that are very similar to electricity and how things are moving between things in sort of circuits. But again, talking about ultimately about sort of this underlying desire, drive, energy that's pushing things.
Yeah, I mean, I don't want to go so off topic, but it's funny. I recently found these, like, if you go through some of these archives, you can find like Deleuze as like a young Deleuze. I think when he was like in his like 20s or teens or something, he was writing to Bergson, and you can find all these like a really enamored Deleuze writing to Bergson in French and stuff. It's a really interesting things you can dig up.
They're really, really interesting for sure. And it's obvious. I mean, so much of his writing is deeply, deeply influenced by a lot of Bergson's later works, for sure. It's impossible to separate them.
At least in my interpretation, right? When I read his book on Bergsonism, he talks about taking the author behind the back. So he goes pretty far away from, I think, Bergson. I mean, he reads Bergson very differently than reading Bergson qua Bergson, right? He almost reads Bergson qua Nietzsche. And I don't think Bergson was actually the biggest fan of Nietzsche. Someone correct me if I'm wrong, but yeah, I don't think Bergson really liked Nietzsche that much. But Deleuze reads Bergson as through his own understanding of Nietzsche. So he has some very interesting interpretations.
Oh, it's interesting. I obviously came to Bergson through Deleuze, and so with that lens, I very much read it with, basically Bergsonism in the back of my head, as well as Cinema 1 and 2, where a lot of it's referenced. So I would love, at some point, we should probably do a reading of something Bergson or a breakdown, because I'd love to really understand sort of if there is an understanding of Bergson's original intentions, because this is how I took it. It's good. Well, does anyone have any last thoughts? Tomorrow, same bat time, same bat channel, we will be going through all of our fun stuff here in the review. Please join us again. If there's any last thoughts or notes on this, because it's we get to stop a few minutes early, which is nice. Yay. I will find the link to Deleuze and Bergson, the correspondence. There's a couple sites that have it. We'll post it up. I'll also upload Bergsonism and a few other things, perhaps in the uploaded documents section, if you guys want to check that out. Cool. Easy enough. Thank you all for coming very much. It's a good group. It's always nice to have all the different opinions. More of you, though. Please talk. Get involved. I'm reading just everything now. Varun took one. Come on, guys. Jack took one. I mean, come on. We can do better.